Welcome to part 2 of the Battlefield Bluffs episode. Last time we discussed the military ruses and tricks used that range from the infamous Trojan horse, the trickery of Hannibal Barca, one of the great military minds in history, and the famous Operation Mincemeat of World War II. This episode we will wrap things up with 3 more stories of deception used in warfare scenarios that continue the creative and inventive ideas people formulate in war to downright creepy and spooky. Every day we're flooded with information. Sometimes it's significant, and sometimes it's just bits of knowledge that we find interesting. We have a deep desire to know about the little things that hold us together as a species. It reminds us of the wonder in the world and the distances we can achieve with the human spirit. It's how we continue to share who we are with each other. It's vital to our advancement, and that's pretty important, even if others find it trivial. 1 year before the famous Operation Mincemeat in World War II in 1942, another incident took place in the Java Sea that showed a captain's ability to think outside of the box in order to get his crew and ship safely out of a deadly situation. It is the embodiment of the Plato quote, "Our need will be the real creator," or as we say it now, necessity is the mother of invention. They were in dire straits and they came up with a solution that was ingenious, albeit risky. This is the story of the Abraham Chrysler. On February 27, 1942, the Battle of the Java Sea took place off the shores of Indonesia. The Imperial Japanese Navy had decimated the Allied fleet in the area in a 7-hour battle. The Japanese had dominated the Allies and sunk many of the ships. A few broke away in retreat but encountered the Japanese again, who finally took down most of the remaining ships. Only 2 ships, the Perth and Houston, remained. Running low on ammunition and fuel, and following the final order of Strike Force Commander Dutch Rear Admiral Karel Doorman before he had been killed to ignore survivors and move to Batavia, the ships left and arrived at Tanjung Priok on 28 February. Also ordered to retreat were the smaller ships in Java during this time. 4 of these would be the 2nd Minesweeper Division operating out of Surabaya, the main naval base in northeast Java. They were under the command of Lieutenant Commander J.R.L. Lebeau. They were told if they could not make it back due to their short-range capabilities, then the ship was to be scuttled. Under no circumstances was the enemy to obtain their ships. These ships had received orders as early as February 17th from the Navy Commander, Rear Admiral P. Coenraad, to attempt escape receiving the code of KPX. However, in early March, the commanders of the Minesweeper Division still weren't sure what to do when that code came through. Meanwhile, the Navy in Surabaya was destroying the harbor facilities to keep it from falling into enemy hands. They were in a situation of, you need to run, but you can't come home. Australia or sink. The Japanese had the Java area totally controlled by sky and sea, and it was now extremely dangerous to be in the area at all. It was time to bail out. Lieutenant Commander Van Meert, the commander of the H.R. Abraham Chrysler, had already started preparing his ship to escape by this time. He ordered the 460-ton minesweeper to be painted in different camouflage colors to distort the shape of the ship. They painted it in hues of gray to imitate rock formations. Also, in a genius move, he had the ship camouflaged with nets, tree branches, and leaves, so the ship would look just like another small island from the sky. The commander then gave his crew an ultimatum at an all-hands call. He told them they could either participate in the dangerous mission or get off of the ship. About half of the 45 crew members exited the ship along with the indigenous personnel on board. These were mostly Indonesians, so they decided to stay behind and fight on land for their home. Decisions were made by each captain as to what they would do with their ship and crew. The commander of the Pieter de Bitter refused to leave harbor and scuttled his ship near Surabaya with 2 timed explosives. 3 ships were left. The Jan van Amstel and the Ellen Dubois left as soon as they could together. The only problem was that they were undersupplied, didn't have enough fuel to make it to Australia, and lacked good enough camouflage. On top of that, the Ellen Dubois was having a problem with its boiler engine. The only remaining minesweeper, the Abraham Chrysler, remained at port a while longer. The commander gathered supplies and topped off their fuel at the maximum 110 tons. Early in the morning on March 7th, the 2 ships that had left previously reached Gili Raja and anchored there, awaiting the next sundown. Traveling by day was most certainly a death sentence. The Abraham Chrysler left the evening before on March 6th at about 9:30 p.m. in an easterly direction, as had the other 2 ships. They arrived at Gili Raja on the morning of the 7th also. They met their sister ships that were already anchored, but chose not to anchor near them as their camouflage wasn't sufficient enough and would negate all the work they had done for the Abraham Chrysler. They went to the next island over to Gili Ginting and waited. This proved to be the right decision, as the Jan Van Amstel and the Ellen Dubois were spotted by a Japanese plane later that day. Since a lot of crew members had deserted the Ellen Dubois, and with the ship having the boiler issues, the decision was made the next day to sink the ship and bring that crew over to the Jan Van Amstel and run. They opened the outboard valves and detonated a depth charge near Gilliging. The Jan Van Amstel was camouflaged and left that night towards Australia. Unfortunately, it was spotted by the Japanese destroyer Arishio, which sunk the minesweeper in the Strait Madura. Keep in mind, these small minesweeping ships were only outfitted with basic defenses. The Jan Van Amstel had one 3-inch gun, 2 twin 50 caliber machine guns, and 40 sea mines. Fighting a large destroyer with that would be like the scene in the movie Godzilla -1, where the tiny boat with a single gun is shooting at a pursuing massive and angry Godzilla. They didn't stand a chance. During the previous day on March 7th, the camouflage was replenished on the Abraham Krijnsen. Immediately after sundown, the Dutch minesweeper left the shores heading east again. They stuck closely to the shores. Early in the morning, on March 8th, the minesweeper arrived at Cangean Island and anchored there. Again, the branches and leaves were replaced with local plant life that matched the nearby shores. Again, at night they were on the move. The next morning they found a safe spot to anchor at Sumbawa and immediately replenished the camouflage. On March 9th, again in the morning, they took a motor dinghy to the island to get fresh water and gather information from the locals. They learned from various sources that there were no Japanese troops there, and nobody had seen their planes in the last 4 days. It proved that they were not looking for the minesweeper. It seemed they didn't even know of its existence. Their camouflage was working. By day, they were just an extension of the island they sat very closely by, and by night, they were a shadow moving across the waters towards safety. There was no minesweeper, just a floating island. As was their pattern, they stocked up with water and coconuts and left after sundown. The next day, rinse, repeat, refresh camouflage. This would be the last time they needed to do this. In the early evening on March 10th, they headed south. The next day, they finally reached the end of the strait they were traveling through and entered the Indian Ocean. They headed south for Australia. In order to keep the vessel from being slowed down, they dumped all of the camo overboard. By the 13th, Australia was in sight. They kept a speed of 10 knots to conserve fuel. They didn't stop at the nearest port, however, as the commander wanted to travel as far as they could from the deadly zone they had just escaped. They carried on to Geraldton, Western Australia. On March 15th, they had made it to safety. The crew finally could relax and replenish the ship. Days later, they left and later arrived at Fremantle, near Perth, on March 20th. They had pulled off one of the greatest naval disguises in history. They were in the clutches of an enemy that surrounded them with massive firepower and had eyes everywhere. But by making themselves look like an island, sticking close to the shores, covering their portholes, turning off all navigation lights, and traveling at night, the lone little ship was able to escape certain death. The outcome of this harrowing experience was that Lieutenant Commander Van Meert and 9 of his crew were decorated for their courage displayed with Cross of Merits. Unfortunately for Lieutenant Commander Decker of the Pieter de Bitter, he was captured and spent 3 years in a Japanese POW camp. After the war, he returned home and was court-martialed in 1948 for sinking his ship, despite the division commander LeBeau telling all of them at the time of escape they could make up their own minds about what to do with the option to destroy their ships and not escape. This went directly against the KPX order that had originally been given. He was dishonorably discharged from service. Talk about a string of bad luck. The Abraham Krijnsen continued to serve for many years as a submarine hunter. It was refitted with heavier weapons, sonar, and a higher amount of depth charges. After the war, it was returned to the Netherlands. She served as a training vessel until the 60s, after which it was decommissioned. It now serves as one of the main attractions of the Royal Netherlands Navy Museum, having been returned to its original condition as much as possible. The commander and crew who served on the Abraham Krijnsen during this legendary escape truly were the embodiment of the quote by Sir Winston Churchill on October 19, 1941.
Never give in. Never give in. Never, never, never. In nothing, great or small, large or petty, never give in except to convictions of honor and good sense. Never yield to force. Never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy.
Moving forward to post-World War II to the 1950s, we come across a story that traverses into the frightening and rather gruesome. Don't worry, we won't scare you with this one too much. The year is 1950 and the World War has finally ended. Countries are rebuilding and trying to recover from the devastation and unrest that was caused. One of these countries was the Philippines. The Philippines had participated in the war on the side of the Allied forces, but promptly after this it had become an independent country after centuries of colonial rule from Spain and later America. Despite the Philippines and U.S. being allies during the war, their relationship was complex and tense. They got along, but the Americans were concerned by the presence of a resistance group called the Hukbo and Bayan Laban sa Hapon, or the Hukbo Lahap for short. They were also referred to as Hooks. This is Tagalog for People's Army Against Japan. Hopefully my Filipino friends will set me straight if I didn't pronounce that right. At least I tried. Anyways, the reason this was of concern was that the group had its roots in communism, and with the Cold War with Russia beginning to stir, it was seen as dangerous. The Hooks appeared to be concerned with creating a nation that was industrious and self-sufficient, where they didn't need to rely on the protection or trade with the United States. To the US and the Philippine officials, this was a problem. Now, this all seems like typical social and cultural push and pull between countries, politicians, military, and local residents, which has been happening since the beginning of time. So where's the scare factor to the story? Well, during this time, mysterious things started happening around the island in relation to this group. Local villages reported that a loud booming voice would suddenly crack through the clouds, casting curses on them in Tagalog. The ominous voice would curse anyone who aided the Hook fighters with shelter or supplies. This led to the Hooks being starved out of hiding and revealed by the locals who were superstitious and didn't want to be forever cursed. Also, the locals would wake in the morning to find a large eye painted on homes that were all looking at one house in between them. The house would be known as the home of a Hook sympathizer, and somebody was telling them they knew about it. It was made very obvious that no one was to help the Hooks in their efforts. But where did the voice from the sky come from? Who marked these homes? No one was certain. To add to the fear and mystery of these events, there started to be attacks on locals by a mysterious creature or force. There were rumors that an aswang was on the loose in the area, and if you were from this area and believed in them, then you would be absolutely frightened of this news, and they were. An aswang is somewhat of a cryptid, and while it's a unique monster, the closest thing it can be compared to is a vampire. However, the aswang is much worse. Brace yourself here, because this is where it gets a bit gruesome. Whereas a vampire will bite you and drain you of your blood, the terrifying aswang also dine on a person's organs. It uses its sharp tongue to probe a person, and then it pierces their skin only to drain a person of their bodily fluids, not just blood. They enjoy livers and hearts. They enjoy eating the unborn children from a mother's womb by using their long proboscis to pull the child from the mother's body. Quite often, miscarriages were blamed on the aswang. They would say one had snuck in quietly and made the child its prey while the mother slept. And that's all the PG version of how bad they are. The aswangs are shapeshifters as well, and often portray themselves as a bird, dog, cat, pig, or vulture, and even more unnerving, as your quiet next-door neighbor you've lived next door to for many years. Some are so thin they can hide behind a bamboo pole. They are fast and very quiet. However, some will make loud noises such as tick-tick, walk-walk, or sok-sok, which is the noise it makes when pursuing prey. They will also bring disease to an area that can devastate a village's populace. There are many variations of the aswang, but one thing is certain, no one would ever want to come across one. So, with this knowledge, it is understandable how scared locals were when a group of Hooks came across one of their own in the jungles laying on the trail, drained of all of his blood, with 2 large puncture marks in his neck. The aswang was on the hunt. Between the eyes of God watching them, the voices from the sky, and the aswang actively hunting them, the Hooks had had enough. They exited the area, and quickly. And that is exactly what the CIA had planned for. Mission accomplished. See, all of this had been a plan devised by one man named Edward Geary Lansdale. Lansdale had been a master of marketing and advertising with clients such as Levi Strauss, Nestle's Nescafe Coffee, and Wells Fargo before the war. However, when the war began, like all of the patriotic Americans who wanted to fight tyranny, Lansdale joined the Army. The Army recognized his special talents and recruited him to the Office of Strategic Services. The OSS was the precursor to the CIA. Lansdale knew people, and he knew how to steer them how he wanted with his previous marketing and advertising experience. He used this knowledge to become a pioneer in PSYOPs, or psychological operations. He used propaganda, media, and marketing strategies to gain support from allies, vilify the enemy, and break them down morally. He was very good at what he did. Once the war was over, however, they needed him to take on a new enemy, the enemy of their former